Yeah, good evening, dear Steve, dear colleagues, dear audience. I'm Birgit Elsner. I'm a professor for developmental psychology at the University of Potsdam, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Baltes Lecture, also on behalf of the organizers, which you see here in this beautiful lecture hall. And it's a great pleasure to see so many of you here in person, because it's our first Baltes Lecture coming back to normal after 2 years of the pandemic. In 2020, we needed to cancel the lecture. Last year, we had an in-person audience and an online speaker, but today, our speaker is here in person, Stephan Lewandowsky. Happy to have you. And before Steve will start with his lecture, I wanted to say some words. And first, let me invite you all, before I forget that, to the reception after the lecture, which will take place behind these screens here. So there's an opportunity to meet and gather again for some drinks and snacks. And let me acknowledge the Margret and Paul Baltes Foundation and the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences for sponsoring this event. But now let's come to the reason why we are all here. This is our highly esteemed speaker, Stephan Lewandowsky, who will give this year's Baltes Lecture. And Steve holds a chair in cognitive science at the University of Bristol, as you can see from the poster. But Steve has a connection to Berlin, actually. He grew up in Berlin in the first years of his life and then moved to Australia, where he spent the rest of his adolescence and first years in science. Steve's impressive research combines cognitive sciences and social sciences, because he focuses on how people process and remember information they get from various sources, among them the social media. And as we all know, such information can transmit facts, but also fakes or fiction. And Steve's work examines how this shapes people's memory and decision-making and knowledge structures, especially in cases when people need to learn that some information they have acquired turns out to be false. So what happens then? And I think we will hear some of that today, how people then update their memory. And as we will also hear today, this research relates perfectly to some current topics of social interest. For instance, whether or not people accept scientific evidence, like facts about vaccination or the climate change. So these are really very current topics. And Steve has written numerous highly influential scientific papers and book chapters, and he has deservedly received many important awards, among them I need to read that, Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award from the Australian Research Council and a Wolfson Research Merit Fellowship from the Royal Society, and also a Humboldt Research Award. And recently he has received an ERC Advanced Grant with the name ProDem-Info, together with many other several large-scale research grants. And this ProDem-Info award is what brought him and connected him to the University of Potsdam, where he is now a guest professor. And we are very honored of that. Steve is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Science in the UK and a fellow of the Association of Psychological Science. And on first view, it may not be easy to draw a connection between Steve's works and Paul Baltes' legacy, but I think Steve is really a perfect fit for this lecture. Because if we think of Baltes' work, he investigated how age-related changes in cognition and intelligence influence older people's daily life, with a special focus on how people can keep up their goals and their life quality even when they are challenged by limited resources. And together with Margaret Baltes, he postulated this very influential theory model that elderly people kind of fight these challenges or deal with these challenges of limited resources by selecting focus areas in their life where they spend their capacities on, that they try to optimize the prevailing capacities and resources and try to compensate for eventual losses or if this is necessary. And I think when we are faced with all this magnitude of information that we get in social media and other media, we kind of can feel with these elderly people because we know that these magnitude of information, surely our cognitive capacities are not sufficient to process them all. So what we also do is we select information. And sometimes, more often we select information that fits to our opinions and that fits well into our view on life in general. And so selection of information and biased processing are the natural consequences of limited cognitive resources. And we will hear some scientific facts about that today. And we will also hear about people who can use this knowledge of limited resources to transmit information that fits to their own interest and how they can then misuse such information and how this can threat democracy. So tonight, Steve will present us with some of his important research. You can see the title here. Demagoguery, Technology and Cognition, Addressing the Threats of Democracy. And we are looking forward to hearing many scientific facts. And we hope that we do not have to learn in some time that some of these facts were wrong and that we have to restore our cognitive representation of this event. But we are looking forward to your lecture. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Thanks.
And please join me in a warm welcome for our speaker, Stephan Lewandowsky.
Am I live? Yes, apparently so. And my slides will also appear in a moment, but until they do, here we are. I just remembered that this is the first time in my life that I am literally between the audience and drinks. So I'm going to be on time. Don't worry. I've been given an hour, and what I want to do in that hour is to talk about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the last few years about threats to democracy and how they arise from the intersection of technology, demagoguery, and our human cognition. And the first slide is the most important one of the whole talk, because it is acknowledging all the people, the incredibly important people, many of them from Berlin, who have contributed to this research and have made it possible. And I would have never been able to do this on my own. Quite on the contrary, I'm gratified by being pulled along by some brilliant colleagues. Now, the departure point for my talk is some data from the last, about 10 years or so that are showing over and over again that worldwide democracy is in retreat. Here's one graph that was published earlier this year by one of several institutes that is studying the fate of democracy around the world. And all you have to know about the graph is any point below the diagonal, anything in this segment here, is a country that has suffered a decline in democracy during the last 10 years. And, you know, the USA is there and quite a few European countries, some of them, you know, even within the EU, they have suffered a serious decline in democracy. And that is sort of my departure point, because the question then is why? Why does this happen? Now, it's impossible to answer that question in a single talk or in a single chapter or anything else. The best that I can do is to pick out a few things that I think are critical to understanding this decline in democracy and to then focus on those. Now, in so doing, I'm not excluding lots of other things that political scientists and philosophers are studying. There's a lot of other things going on, but today I want to talk about the things or people I've researched: demagogues, human cognition, and social media. And the point I want to make, to put it up front, is that there's a, you know, what I would call maybe an antagonistic relationship between social media and human cognition, but of course also between demagogues and human cognition, and that there is some sort of synergistic relationship between social media and populist politicians who are spreading a lot of disinformation and who are arguably undermining our democracy. So that's basically a roadmap of my talk tonight. Put these three aspects of what is a very complicated problem and involves lots of other factors. So let's start out with the demagogues, or at least one of them. You're perhaps familiar with this individual. He was president of the United States for 4 years, during which time he made, give or take, more than 30,000 false or misleading claims, according to fact checkers. And that's a stunning number. Even if you disagree with some of the stuff, you know, I'm sort of happy to auction off a few thousand if you think it's only 29,000. But, you know, there was a huge number of false or misleading claims. What does that do to democracy? What does it do to society? What does it do to the media? That's the first question I want to examine, and I want to focus on the media. I want to focus in particular on agenda setting, political agenda setting. And the reason I want to do that is because the conventional wisdom, from the pre-Facebook era of humanity, the conventional wisdom was that the media is setting the agenda of public discussion and political discourse. And indeed, there's evidence, experimental evidence even, showing how that can happen. If you intervene with the content of the media, public discussion shifts. The media are setting the agenda. Or do they? Well, I would argue that social media has opened up an opportunity for agenda setting by others. I would argue that Donald Trump was a genius in doing that. And let me now take you back in time to November 2016. Donald Trump had been elected president, but wasn't yet president. And one evening, he started tweeting quite vigorously. And he wasn't happy. He was not happy that his wonderful future Vice President Mike Pence was harassed last night at the theater on Broadway. They should apologize. And it went on and on and on. What had happened? Well, what had happened is that there was a performance of the play Hamilton, and at the end of the performance, knowing that Pence was in attendance, the cast of the play was on the stage pleading for a diverse America because they were scared of the implications of Trump's victory. Now, this made the news, and public interest soared. These data are from Google Trends. That just tells you how many people searched for the term Trump Hamilton over time, and you can see that there was this massive spike of interest. Now, here's the thing. something else happened on that day. On that day, Trump settled a lawsuit for fraud against his Trump University for $25 million, including a penalty to the state of New York, thereby admitting his own culpability in this fraudulent university. Now, did people care? No. The Trump University settlement barely shows up, and it coincides with perhaps this shiny object that Trump was throwing out there to misdirect and to divert attention from something that he didn't like. Now, this is purely anecdotal, so that's not good enough. If we want to understand what's going on, we got to have data. So what do? Well, we looked for shiny objects systematically. Now, what we did in this research that came out a few years ago in Nature Communications, we looked at all of the New York Times and ABC News coverage in the United States, the two premier sources of news in the United States, during the 2-year period that covered the Russia-Mueller investigation. This is ancient history now, but you may recall that there was clearly an attempt by the Russians to meddle in the American election, and there was pretty good evidence that Donald Trump and his team were quite pleased by that. Now, we then statistically related that coverage to the content of Donald Trump's tweets. And the question was twofold. Number one, how would Donald Trump respond when the media talk about Russia and Mueller? And the second question, how would the media respond to Donald Trump the next day? That's the question, and the question has a fairly clear answer, and to explain the answer, I have to explain a fairly complicated graph. But once I've explained it, the graph will instantly tell you what's going on. All right, it's very complicated. There are two axes. One is called B1, the other one B2. What on earth does that mean? Well, it means that for each possible pair of words occurring in one of Donald Trump's tweets, we estimated how much that was a function of the coverage in the New York Times about Russia and Mueller. And we plotted that along the x-axis. Now, we did the same thing for the y-axis, but flipping it around, trying to estimate what is the coverage of the New York Times about these topics Trump doesn't like as a function of what he tweeted the day before. We plot that on the y-axis. What does that mean when I say that? Well, it means the following. It means that any pair of words that showed up in Donald Trump's tweets has a location in space. How many pairs of words are there like that? Well, thousands. So I have thousands of dots that I'll show you in a second. Each dot has a location based on how much it responded to the New York Times and how much the New York Times responded to that particular tweet. Now, let's work out what should happen if nothing is going on. Well, if nothing is going on, then on average, everything should cluster in the middle around 0 with only chance deviation. That means nothing is happening. Boring result. Now, if there are lots of points to the right, then that means that whatever these points represent, whatever words they represent, that's the rhetoric Donald Trump is engaging in response to Russia and Mueller, perhaps with the intention to deflect media coverage. Now, if he's successful in that, then the media will stop talking about Russia and Mueller, and then you should get a point cloud down here. Right, very complicated, but once you get that, kind of easy to sort of look at. Now, this projector isn't the best in the world. It's probably the second best, because you can't see the dots. But what you can see is that there is a blue smudge inside the red square and the red circle. And that means nothing is happening, okay? Statistically speaking. Where there is something happening is when things fall outside these quadrants and then they turn red. so you can see them. So not much is happening. Gardening puts him to sleep. There's a lot of stuff on the left. Skiing has no effect. Football, no effect. Even the economy doesn't have an effect. The word clouds at the bottom tell you the content of the New York Times for these keywords, these key topics. These are obviously controlled topics. This is not supposed to show you anything other than randomness. Okay, so Donald Trump is not responsive to gardening, and the New York Times doesn't care what Donald Trump tweets in response to their gardening section. We know that now. What about Russia and Mueller? Well, looks very different. Two things. First of all, he goes wild. Lots of words being tweeted over here, and guess what? The New York Times the next day is reducing its coverage of Russia and Mueller. Is that a statistical artifact? Is this just the New York Times? No. ABC does exactly the same thing. They're synchronized in response to Donald Trump's tweets. On any other news topic, ABC News and New York Times are not correlated with each other, but they do synchronize and dance to Trump's tune, so I would argue, whenever he is responding to Russia-Mueller coverage he doesn't like. So what is he tweeting about? What is going on? All you now know is that there's a bunch of points that move into the bottom right quadrant. Well, what is actually happening, and these are word clouds to illustrate that, is that when the New York Times talks about Russia, Mueller, etc., then Donald Trump starts tweeting more and more about jobs, taxes, probably tax cuts, about China, about North Korea, little rocket man, I've got a bigger button, that sort of thing. That is what he's tweeting about in response to things he clearly didn't like. And what happens the next day? The New York Times says, oops, and is no longer talking about Russia and Mueller that much. Now, the word cloud is entirely for illustration. The effect sizes are smaller than that, but that gives you a sense of how social media permits agenda setting by demagogues, in this case, or perhaps politicians more generally, because that is the next question. Is Donald Trump the only one out there with a button on Twitter? And the answer is no, of course not. And we published a paper a few weeks ago that looked at this in more detail. We looked at political elites in the United States, the UK, and Germany. I'm only going to show you the American data for reasons of time. What we did was to look at all the tweets by all members of Congress, both houses of Congress, between 2016 and 2022. And that's about 1.6 million tweets. We looked at all the links and all the tweets, and we checked the quality of the information being linked to in a tweet that contained a link. So if a congressperson said, oh, look over here, the New York Times is saying X, Y, Z, or look over there, Breitbart makes the following claim, then we looked at the links and we looked at the trustworthiness of the domain using a service by NewsGuard, which is using journalistic criteria, strict criteria, to examine the quality of a domain. Not individual news items, but the quality of the domain. What do we find? Well, this is using the American color coding, where the right-wing party is red, Republicans, and the less right-wing party is blue, the Democrats. And below the line, you see the number of Congress people, each triangle here is a person, who never share bad information according to NewsGuard. And you can see there's a lot more blue here than there is red. In addition, we're representing ideology on a continuous scale from left to right. That's why it's spread out along this axis. And we find again that the further right you go, well, the more misinformation or potential misinformation is being tweeted. Anything above this horizontal line represents a percentage of times that a tweet is pointing to a link that's dodgy, untrustworthy, as measured by NewsGuard. And if you want to have a continuous picture over time, then it turns out that there's always been a slight difference between Democrats, who tend to be sharing only sources considered to be trustworthy, and Republicans who, interestingly, dropped off precipitously after 2020, after the Biden election. And just as a footnote, this striking partisan difference does not exist in the UK or Germany. German mainstream parties don't really differ from each other much in their accuracy. Yeah, I mean, the extremes do. AfD, Die Linke, they're different. But the mainstream is about the same and highly accurate, the same in the United Kingdom. So it's not conservatism per se, it is that there is something about the particular context in the United States that leads conservative political elites to spread more misinformation. Now, this is entirely consonant with a number of analyses done by others in recent years who have repeatedly shown that conservative voters consume and share more misinformation than liberals. And to connect this to Paul-B Baltes, that difference is accentuated vastly among elderly people. The people who are most at risk of consuming or spreading misinformation in the United States are older, very conservative Americans. They're an order of magnitude worse off than liberals. Now, the reasons for that are unclear. However, I would argue that our data identify the elites as a significant vector. And if they do that, well, then it's not entirely surprising, perhaps, that the voters are following suit. So, I've shown, I hope, that there is a symbiosis between populism and demagoguery and social media. Now, the next thing I want to look at is how do demagogues affect people psychologically? Back to Donald Trump. He's a great example because the numbers are so large. He made all these false claims, but guess what? His followers throughout his presidency, 3/4 of them considered Donald Trump to be honest. Honest. How can you be honest if you lie all the time? That's a puzzle. And it's a real puzzle because some of the lies are so blatant. This is from day one, maybe day two, of Donald Trump's presidency, when his press secretary said Trump had the largest audience to ever witness inauguration, period. And he meant by that people present at the inauguration. Now, that's not true. There are fewer people on the left for Donald Trump than there are for Barack Obama on the right. There's no question. So why say that? Why say something that is so completely falsified? Why lie when it can be disproven? Why lie so often that very often they don't even have a purpose anymore? What's the point of lying if no one believes anything you say anyway? Well, the answer, I think, is that what is happening here is that there is a fundamental, new, different ontology of truth that is underlying this populism and demagoguery. Ontology is about the nature of things. So when I talk about an ontology of truth, I'm talking about what is the nature of truth. How is it understood by people like Donald Trump and his followers, and why? Well, this, I think, is a critical citation by Donald Trump. He's telling his followers, just remember what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening. In other words, trust me. I will tell you what to believe. If I tell you it's raining and you look out the window and the sun is shining, do not trust your lying eyes. Listen to me, because I'm telling you what the weather is. Is this successful? Yes, it is highly successful. Here's an experiment done by Schaffner and Lux a few days after the inauguration. They showed the photos I just showed you to participants. And the only task for the participant was to pick the photo that had more people in it. Now, choosing the Trump photo is wrong. I mean, there's no question. It's wrong. There are fewer people in that photo. And non-voters rarely make that error, neither do Clinton voters. Those errors are just people having a laugh, or the cat jumps on the mouse or something. You know, these errors are just noise. But now look at Trump voters. Highly educated Trump voters, 26% of them chose the wrong photo. Do they have worse eyesight than Clinton voters? No, that is not what's going on. What I think is going on is something called participatory propaganda, where people pick up the message from the leaders and say, haha, I'm going to own those libs. Those experimenters, they're liberals. You know what? I'm going to tell them that photo has more people in it because I support Donald Trump. And that, I think, gets us to the heart of the matter, which is the relationship between populism and truth. What's populism? Well, populism is a thin ideology, thin because it has no content whatsoever, other than creating artificially a distinction between, on the one hand, the virtuous people who can do no wrong, and opposing that, a corrupt, evil elite. People like doctors, scientists, politicians, mainstream journalists. The list goes on. Now, it negates pluralism. It is therefore anti-democratic inherently, because there's only one right answer, and that is whatever the people think. And they tend not to think, but are being told what they should think. And a corollary of this, what accompanies this division, is this affirmation of common sense and denigration of so-called evidence that are sprouted as lies by the elites. Now, the moment you put that in place and it is successful and grabs a toehold in society, the whole idea of shared truth-seeking is disabled. You can no longer look for truth, because the populists are always going to say, oh, what, climate change? Are you kidding? The scientists are trying to create the world government. What, vaccines? You got to be kidding. They're experimental drugs. They're out to kill us, or whatever. You cannot have truth-seeking discourse when that takes hold in society. Okay, but why do those people think Donald Trump is honest? Well, the explanation that I favor is that in the populist logic of truth, authenticity replaces accuracy. What's authenticity? Well, authenticity means two things. Number one, you speak your mind and you say what you think. And if there's one thing that Donald Trump was, it was that he was authentic. Like a 3-year-old, you always knew how he felt. Each tweet gave you insight into his feeling at the time. You could tell that he was angry. No question about it. He was authentic. And also, by using lies that could be easily disproven, by continuing to issue them, he was signaling that he was an authentic champion of the real people, because he was flouting an establishment norm. It's the elites that tell kids not to lie. Education is an elite norm. What did Donald Trump do? trash universities, right? Well, of course he would, because they're an elitist construct. And if you're a populist, then you have to signal constantly that you're anti-elitist by undermining all the institutions that characterize a liberal democracy. And if the leader does that, then the partisans follow suit, and they participate in the propaganda, and they believe even big lies, such as that about a stolen election. It's all bad news, because there's a lot of populism around. But here is a boundary condition on this. And this is from an experiment by Oliver Hall and colleagues where they manipulated a synthetic world in the laboratory that included an election. And in one condition, they made it look as though the election was corrupt and that a candidate who was demonstrably lying was defending an outgroup in that election. That is when people accepted the lie. When either one of those conditions was not met, so if the election was not perceived as corrupt, or the liar didn't champion the people, then the participants in the experiment considered that unacceptable. People do not like being lied to unless they think it is a signal of somebody who's taking on a corrupt establishment. And we got to keep that in mind when we talk about the future, which I will do towards the end of my lecture. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is the relationship between social media and cognition. Now, if you're really interested in that, some colleagues and I wrote this report for the European Commission 2 years ago, which you can find at that link, but don't write it down now. I got a QR code at the end for a lot of resources if you're interested, where we touched on the key pressure points between cognition and technology. What do we mean by that? What I mean by that is that we identified 4 different attributes of the online social media technology that are particularly challenging for humans and our cognitive apparatus. There's 4 of them here. I only have time to focus on 2. The attention economy and content curation. So let's go. What's the attention economy? Well, this by now has become fairly common knowledge that online, the main product that is being sold is human attention. And as a rule of thumb, if you're online and you get a service and it's free, then you're being sold. It's as simple as that. Your attention is being sold to advertisers. Now, what follows from that is that for the platforms to make money, they want to keep you on the platforms, and they'll do anything to keep you there. For example, YouTube will just keep playing videos even if you don't ask for them, by default. That's to keep you there because each video has an ad in it, and the ads flash up on the side and on the top, and there's, ads everywhere. Now, I'm not knocking this altogether because this has enabled a free economy where you get stuff of incredible value for free. You used to have to pay a lot of money to get maps, and now you pull out your phone, you use Google Maps, and you get it so much more than you could ever have bought in the bad old days of paper. So it's terrific, but it comes with consequences. Well, one of the consequences arises from this fundamental misalignment of the attention economy compared to conventional economies of the past. In the past, in the steam engine Jurassic past, producers made things like toasters or cars to make you happy, to satisfy your preferences. And if the car blew up whenever somebody tapped it in the back, then there was a pretty strong consumer signal to the manufacturer that that was not such a good Pinto, okay? Why don't you fix that or we buy different cars? A fairly clear signal. The attention economy is fundamentally different because you are not involved in the commercial transaction, except indirectly. The commercial transaction is between the platforms and the advertisers. So the platforms are not building toasters for you. They're doing something for their advertisers in which you are at best an innocent bystander. So what happens if the platform's interests or the advertiser's interests run counter to the well-being of users? What's the corrective mechanism, the consumer signal? Well, I would argue that this is fairly problematic, and it's not entirely clear what the signal is. And the reason it is problematic is because we know that human attention is captured by novelty and negative emotion. We pay attention to things that are scary, frightening, outrageous, terrible. You know, we drive past an accident and we can't help but to look. Our attention just gets sucked into that. That's just a human bias. And so, if you make misinformation outrage-provoking and emotional, then you're exploiting a human attentional bias. And in so doing, guess who makes the money? Well, the platforms do because they can sell more ads. So there's an incentive. The very structure of the platforms is incentivizing poor quality information. That is not just hypothetical. Here's an analysis of 160,000 newspaper articles that were shared by Congress people in the United States. This is from the study earlier about the Congress people. Another aspect of it, we looked at every single one of these articles and determined through a machine how emotional the piece was. And we then plot the quality again through NewsGuard as a function of the quality of the domain. And now let's focus on the negative emotions. The more disgust, the more anger, the more fear, the lower the quality of the content as assessed by NewsGuard. Highly emotional stuff tends to be bad information, but it captures people's attention. So where is the money? The money is at the wrong end of this graph because the platforms make more money by giving you highly emotive material. And it just so happens it's bad for you. Platforms don't care. They just take in another $1 billion. So that is the fundamental problem of the attention economy. And of course, it goes hand in hand with content curation. Because the reason the platforms ultimately make more money with low quality information is because they have algorithms and recommender systems that are favoring that highly emotive information. Now, I don't think the platforms are out there to feed you bad stuff, but they will feed you stuff that keeps you there. And that coincidentally happens to be bad on average because our attention is captured by things that are bad. Now, I don't have time to go through all of this in great detail, but these algorithms are important. There's been countless experiments showing that the order in which you present stuff or the way in which you curate a news feed is changing people's preferences and their beliefs and attitudes and potentially even their voting behavior. So this stuff matters. And it matters a great deal because at least 30% of every video ever watched on YouTube was never chosen by the user. It just ran automatically after the previous one. So this is a serious problem, and it's a serious problem in particular because the algorithms are powerful. Let me show you how powerful they are. And to do so, I have to place this into context. The context is that of conventional wisdom in advertising. The best ad you can imagine is the one you show to the one person who's going to buy your product. Oh, you want this car? I have an ad for you. Oh, thank you, you bought it. Great. That's efficient, okay? Showing ads to millions of people who don't want your product is bad for everybody. The producer, but also the consumer, because it's a waste of money. It's driving up prices. It's passed on to the consumer. So you don't want ads to be wasted. And the conventional response has been for decades to segment the audience. And that's why you see few lipstick ads in motorcycle magazines, few toys on TV after bedtime. You know, this is all completely natural, up to a point. What point is that? Well, I would argue this perhaps is problematic. If an algorithm can tell when a teenager needs a confidence boost because they're feeling worthless in the moment, in real time, it's kind of concerning if they sell that information to advertisers. Now, Facebook says they never did, but they also didn't dispute that information is something they have access to. And somewhere between audience segmentation, on the one hand, the lipstick magazines or whatever, motorcycle magazines without lipsticks, and this knowing somebody's emotion in the moment, somewhere along the line, there is a boundary that turns legitimate advertising into powerful manipulation that can do enormous harm. Now, fortunately, the public agrees. Here is some data that are from the US, UK, and Germany, published by Anastasia Kozareva and our team last year, where we asked people about algorithms. And we asked them what they thought was okay to use for personalization. And let me give you a snapshot of these data in two different slices. The first slice here is looking at what is okay to personalize. And anything to the left of the thick vertical line means, whoa, I don't like it. Anything to the right in purplish blue is okay. And so people say, well, it's perfectly fine if you recommend local events to me that are personalized. If I like bowling, tell me something about a bowling championship. Don't tell me about the tennis match because I don't like tennis. People are okay with that. They're okay with recommending movies, music, restaurants, even people on social media. And interestingly, this didn't differ too much between the countries. But when it comes to political campaign messages, Germans, don't like that at all when they're personalized. Neither do the people in the UK. And even Americans, they're more tolerant, but still, they don't like it that much. So there's a clear rank ordering there, and people have a very clear handle on this and an opinion about what it is that is okay to be personalized and what isn't. Now let's look at the same data another way, slicing it differently. What information can I use to customize the information to you? How do you feel about a personal tragedy, your wife's death, to be used for targeting? Well, people really don't like that in Germany, Great Britain, and also in the US. And household income is a no-no. Religious views, a no-no. Sexual orientation, it goes on and on and on. People hate it if that's being used for micro-targeting. They're okay, though, with age and gender. That's okay. That's so obvious and visible and easily identifiable. People don't care, if you don't try to sell hygiene products to men. That makes sense. People are okay with that. And what's very interesting is that these opinions I've just shown you are not politically polarized. Right and left, Republicans and Democrats don't differ. And that is absolute magic, because finding anything these days that doesn't polarize Republicans and Democrats, there's not much. Even broccoli is probably polarized, but this isn't. Right, so now what are we going to do? I've shown you a lot of things that are challenging, that I think can explain in part what might be going wrong with our democracy. And it's all kind of, you get to the point where you just want to walk home, or you want to walk over there for a drink. And you say, well, what are we going to do? As it turns out, we can do quite a few things. And I want to spend the last few minutes talking about what we can do addressing our three objects: the demagogues, human cognition, and social media. Now, of course, this is a whole series of lectures in itself. In 5 minutes, the best I can do is give you a flavor of what can be done. Now, remember how I reported an experiment by Hall and colleagues that showed that demagogues only find traction under certain circumstances. So one thing we have to look at is, if part of the problem is populism, and I think it is because of its altered view of truth that is inherently anti-democratic, if we want to do something about populism, maybe we should have a look and see where it's coming from. Now, that's a very complicated endeavor, and I can't answer that fully, but what I can do is I can show you some data that link to the experiment I showed you earlier. What I'm showing you here is American data. It's the increase for 30 years post-war in productivity, that is how much each worker in the economy produced, and how much more money that worker was paid. And what you see here is Economics 101. As productivity goes up, that's the lighter blue line, I think, we'll find out in a second. Right now it doesn't matter because they're on top of each other. As productivity goes up, so do wages. And that happened for 30 years. And then it stopped. Wow, it didn't stop. Productivity kept going up. I mean, this is fairly linear, maybe with a couple of bumps, but it's not the case that the economy stalled. No, productivity kept increasing, but wages didn't. And the area between those two curves translates into a squintillion dollars that are not in the pockets of workers. So guess what? You think they're happy about this? No, they're smart enough to know that something as bad is going on, and so they're incredibly frustrated. They feel left behind, and that was one of the conditions, feeling left behind, where people will accept lying demagogues. And yes, they feel left behind for good reason, because they have been left behind. So if Trump comes along and says, we're going to win so much you'll get tired of winning, then hey, why wouldn't they accept him lying? That's great. He's one of us. So we have to understand that. The other thing we can do to deal with populism is to protect people while they're discussing important issues against demagogues. Now, this by itself, again, is a whole research area, lots to talk about. I just want to give you a very quick history of the Republic of Ireland in 30 seconds. The Republic of Ireland conducted 2 referenda on perhaps the most hot-button issues in the universe, abortion and gay marriage. And the country didn't blow up, unlike the neighboring island that also had a referendum. And one of the reasons that it worked is because they put roughly 100 random citizens into a room, 10 days throughout the year, spread over weekends, and these random citizens discussed the issues at hand. And they issued recommendations at the end. The important thing is that they deliberated with moderation by a Supreme Court judge, expert input, public submissions, no tabloids, okay? They were outside the room. And they came up with, this is pretty much the whole text of the abortion recommendations, together with some indication of how the opinions were split. And the Republic of Ireland, until now, has been spared populism, and I would argue that's one of the reasons. It's a little more complicated than that. They also have a better media culture, but you know, the deliberative assemblies have made a huge difference and can serve as a bulwark against demagogues. Here's a very provocative quote by Shoshana Zuboff, who's been a very influential critic of social media, and she says, well, you can have Facebook or democracy, but not both. You know, and to some extent, there's a lot of truth in that. I talked about algorithms and how, you know, they can be distorting and they can favor the, you know, wrong kind of information, low quality information. But again, you know, it's up to us to shape the internet. And it can be, you know, it's possible to sketch out an internet for the future, which Peter Pomerantsev and I have done here. And just to illustrate, you know, if you had a democratic internet, you would know which of your data are being used to show you stuff. You would know who is targeting people with what and on what basis and how much money they spend during election campaigns. Now, some of these ideas are, I mean, none of them are new. Some of them have been taken up by recent legislative initiatives by the European Union, such as the Code of Practice and the Digital Services Act, and I think, frankly, that we're heading in that direction, although at a slow pace, and it's far from clear who's going to win the arms race at the moment, but we are pointing in the right direction. And the final thing you can do is you can look after yourself. We can look after ourselves. We can boost human cognition, and we can inoculate people against misinformation. Now, there's lots more that we can do. I want to conclude by telling you about boosting and inoculation. Boosting is an intervention that makes people smarter, takes their cognition, and rather than saying, oh, you're all biased, boosting says, well, you're kind of clever, but you know what? You can do better. And then they learn something. Inoculation is a specific type of boost that is protecting people against misinformation. And we've done this, we tested that in experiments relevant to the issue at hand. Here's one study where we exposed people to ads, and we asked people to classify the ads into whether or not they're targeted at their personality. How would you know whether these ads are targeted at you? Well, you would know when I explain to you that there are extroverts who are people that are outgoing and love to party, and there are introverts who are people who love to stay at home and read books. And then I give you feedback on your personality along that dimension. And all of a sudden, if you know that you're an extrovert, you will say, oh, that's targeting me. This one isn't. And we can boost people's accuracy at detecting when they're targeted by 20% through a 2-minute, 3-minute intervention. And we can do it on YouTube, online, with tens of thousands of people using very brief videos that we designed to tell people when they might be manipulated. And this is in fact being rolled out by Google as we speak in Eastern European countries to protect the public against misinformation about Ukrainian refugees. Now, here's an example of the kind of video, I hope.
You might think about skipping this out.
Oh, no.
Don't. What happens next?
Can you hear it?
Wait, you're still here?
You hear it?
Great. Looks like your trick worked. You See, when watching videos or browsing online, you're likely to encounter content that is loaded with emotional language, and with good reason. Playing into emotions, especially negative ones such as fear, anger, or contempt, is a trick to get you to pay attention to something when you otherwise wouldn't. It's likely that is a big part of the reason you're still watching this ad is because you were lured in by our use of emotional language in the very first sentence. Research has shown that expressing emotion is key for the spread of moral and especially political ideas in social networks. So let's say when you're writing a headline and you're trying your hardest to manipulate your readers to click. One thing you can do is pepper your headlines with a bunch of emotionally charged words. Call it a horrific accident instead of a serious one, a disgusting ruling instead of a disagreeable one, or a heartbreaking twist of fate instead of an unfortunate coincidence. That way, you're likely to reach more people and influence their reactions. So let's see how this plays out in real life. Let's take the following headline from the movie Anchorman. No emotional manipulation at play here, just to the point, no-nonsense coverage of such an important event in world history. This headline, on the other hand, see what they did there? The writer used an emotionally charged word like revolting to describe a whole group of people. I mean, these people. Oh well, you get the point. They're fear-mongering. So whenever you feel outraged or angry, remember, someone may be pulling your strings. Don't be manipulated. Truth Labs. The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Okay, that's our stimulus from the experiment, and Truth Labs is jointly owned by the University of Cambridge and the University of Bristol. And so, with that simple inoculation, we can protect people against being misled by emotive material, and they will not trust those messages or less, and they will also share them less. And that is just one glimpse at the whole toolbox of interventions that we have to deal with human cognition. So let me wrap up. I talked about a lot of things. I talked about a lot of threats, and I think the threats are real. Our democracy is at risk. But I think it's not inevitable. We can understand those social processes. We can understand populism. We can envisage an internet for democracy, and we have tools, psychological and cognitive tools, that can be deployed, at least a little bit, to help people get smarter at that. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning, don't write down links. I have resources. I do have a whole bunch of resources, a lot of them in German. That's why I put them up here in German, about how to deal with uncertainty, how to debunk, how to deal with conspiracy theories. There's some helpful websites. And all you got to do is point your phone at that QR code, and you can download anything you want. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention. And I look forward to your questions first, and then drinks. Thank you.
So, thank you, Steve. I think we have some microphones for questions, but maybe it's enough if you just speak that can be covered.
I can repeat the question and then. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for an inspiring talk.
Thank you.
I have a question to your very first slide.
Oh, yes.
It was,
Did I forget somebody?
it was the democracy index.
Oh, that one.
You told us that it went down
Yes.
within 10 years, and
Yes.
then you asked why.
Yes.
But what is it? What is inside this score? I can't understand the question why when I don't know what.
Okay, this is a democracy index that is published by one of several institutes that work on this called VDEM. And they look at things like freedom of the press, independence of the judiciary, gerrymandering of elections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole, complicated buffet of indicators that tells us about the democratic health of a country. And it isn't just the fact that there are elections, because you can have elections that, Putin has elections. So, that's not a reliable indicator by itself. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture as well. I had a question about the agenda setting that you were talking
Right.
about. With your model, you have that being mediated by the media still. And what I was wondering is, how can we look at the media being short-circuited, people moving away from traditional forms of media on TV or websites and just listening to what people are saying on social media, for example?
Absolutely. Yeah, very good question. Are the media necessary even? Well, we've done the same analysis with Google Trends that I showed you for the media. And what we find is something very similar, which is that when Donald Trump distracts the media, he's also distracting the public, because we find a reduction in Google Trends searches for Russia Mueller when he's distracting with his tweets about jobs. That didn't make it into the paper, but we do have the data, and so you're absolutely right. The media can be bypassed. Yeah?
Thank you very much, very impressive. I'm interested in this association between emotion and information quality.
Yes.
And you showed the results for the negative emotion.
Correct.
I wondered whether you also looked at positive emotion.
I'm sure we did.
Yeah. I finally say something about it.
No.
Some of these huge cat videos, I kind of
Yes.
see so much information quality in that.
Yes.
Even more eudaimonic emotion, self-transcendent emotion, people may be manipulated by these emotions.
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, I can't answer it because I don't recall what the numbers are for that. What we do know, though, is that the human attentional bias is towards negative emotions. And so and that is key, that people are drawn into negative things, because we have to understand that capturing of attention. And that is true for negative more than for positive. We know that for sure. That's why we looked at the negative to see, well, if that happens, does that actually mean people get drawn to worse information? And the answer is yes. Now, what we have done probably, but I don't recall, is the pattern for the positives. I can certainly find out. You send me an email, I'll ask my postdoc to tell me, and I'll let you know. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. In the slide about the inauguration,
Yes.
it showed quite a lot more higher educated people.
Yes. Yes.
That seems to go against the commonly held belief that it's actually uneducated people who are more susceptible.
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, in case you don't know this, Donald Trump was elected by white, wealthy, rich Americans, not by poor people. Poor people voted for Hillary Clinton. The higher up you went the annual income scale, the more people voted for Trump. His own rhetoric has led to us forgetting that. But it was actually rich people who voted for Donald Trump. Now, but the point is excellent about higher educated people. Why are they more susceptible? Well, this is no isolated case. Higher educated and smarter people very often are far more susceptible to their biases because they're clever enough to figure out what's going on. If you're a highly educated Republican and you participate in that experiment 2 days after the controversy broke, you know exactly why that question is being asked. You know it's not about counting heads. It's about, do I support Trump or the Democrats? And so they will respond accordingly. People who are not as educated may not have seen the photo, so they may figure, well, I don't know. And then some of them might remember Trump. And we see this quite a lot, that higher education, for example, makes polarization along climate change much worse. Highly educated Republicans are the least likely to accept climate change. They differ more from highly educated Democrats than Democrats and Republicans do at the lower end of the education scale. So don't educate a Republican. No, I didn't say that, but it's, yeah, woman.
Thanks for a great talk. And I just wanted to come back to this altered ontology of truth.
Yes.
So that in part we live in a society where truth is seen as a weapon, so to say, and you take sides, and you feel alienated from the kind of truth, as it were, that is represented by what we typically associate with science and evidence and so on. And I think that also in Germany, not just in other countries, we see pockets of parts of society where there is this distrust against evidence, and where evidence is seen as a mode of oppression, or as a mode basically to take your liberty away. And I think once you are in this state, what are good ways of getting back into a different state? And I know that you mentioned some such as boosting or inoculation, but my fear is that the problem already starts when you would even try to approach people in that manner.
I think you're absolutely right, and I never said or wanted to imply that boosting and inoculation are going to save the world. Sorry, Ralph. But, they're part of the toolbox that we have available to make a tiny bit of a difference, and we have to put a lot of these things together if you want to make a difference at all. What I think is much more important to my mind is to understand the political reasons underlying this. Populism. And that's why I showed you the productivity wage gap, those data, you may recall. It's no surprise that if people get the sense they're being screwed, which is what the graph effectively shows, let's be honest about it, then that they then become receptive to populist messages. The same with inequality. Inequality is a driver of some of these tendencies. And I think, to me, if you really wanted to make a difference, you got to have a frank conversation about politics and about the power structure in society, because everything else, is a consequence of that. And that's where you have to start. Now, that's easier said than done, because once these people are in power, the last thing they want to do is to correct that problem, because that's the problem they feed on. So you got to capture that before it's too late. And then, of course, you can have you got a grassroots engagement at the community. Get people involved in the community on decisions at the community level, and do trust building work. Don't fly in an expert in a helicopter to tell the village what to do with their flood wall, right? You're going to alienate everybody. Instead, have the guy drive in and spend a week in the village talking to farmers. And there's plenty of evidence showing that that makes a big difference. When knowledge is being co-produced between experts and people at the grassroots level, that is building trust. And that's the currency of all of this, is trust. People trust, then they're not going to fall for Donald Trump. Yes?
So one of the many interesting facts I learned in your talk is that apparently it's the elderly who share misinformation more.
Yes.
My question, however, is about how you describe it. You said they are more at risk and they are worse off because they do that. Why did you choose to describe them as victims? Because the sharing of information is a voluntary decision.
Well, that's a good point. In that sense, I guess they're not victims. But if they share something they think that is true, but it's totally false and they don't get it, then in that sense, they're victims. But by the way, I'm not even sure. Okay, we don't know why it is exactly that elderly people share more misinformation. Okay? Now, it could be their age. They're just old. Or it could be that they learned about social media too late in life. It could be a cohort effect. And that when digital natives get to that age, they will not fall into the same trap. That's entirely possible. Now, the third reason that I think might also contribute to this is that they do this for fun. Because their grandchildren are going to go crazy and start talking to them on Facebook. Hey, granddad, why do you believe this crap? Oh, let's have a conversation, okay? Why don't you come over for some tea? There may be, it's possible that there is a social component to that, because causing outrage in your family is some people find that gratifying, It gets their attention. So let's not underestimate that.
I was wondering about precisely that question. Have you compare it as well to like elderly communities in Germany?
That's a very good question, yes. Okay. I can't answer that because we don't know enough about age effects in Germany or European countries. One of the problems with a lot of this is that the United States is extremely data rich compared to all other countries. I mean, I live in the UK and I know nothing about the UK because there are no data. You know, I mean, it doesn't seem that you know anything about British public opinion, or at least not at the same level of detail. So, in European, I know of one study that looked at age across various different countries, including Poland and Germany, and I forget what else, and they didn't find an effect of age in European countries. So, but that is just one study, and it was a relatively small sample, so I'm very hesitant to conclude too much from that. That's an open question. I don't want to say anything now that then has to be corrected, right, later on, so.
Would it be very interesting then to understand whether people actually believe these narratives and fake news, and because some of this, if they were, as if you have the opinion that many of those were just somehow making fun of the establishment, and that nobody believes that all these children are out in the sun around there.
Yeah.
What do you think? How can we measure if they actually believe it, or if it's more like a code?
Yes.
I don't want to swear, but establishment.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's an open debate because people are divided on that. Is this what we call expressive responding, where people just say anything to get a point across that's not actually about the issue at hand, right? Like with the Trump photos, the inauguration photos. Are people just signifying I'm a Trump supporter, but they're not actually thinking that there are more people in that photo? That's an extremely difficult question to answer. There are some people who think, they don't believe this, they're just saying it. Okay, but then explain to me several things. Number one, why would there be a violent insurrection on Capitol Hill about a big lie, which is that the election was stolen? Of course it wasn't stolen. And enough people thought it was to go and attack the heart of the United States government. Well, they had to believe something to make that happen. Why would a guy walk into a pizza shop in Washington with an AK-47 and start firing it if he didn't believe there were children in the basement being abused by Democrats? That's that Pizzagate example. I mean, these lies translate into action. If you look at vaccination rates, there's a huge difference between Democratic states and Republican states. And if you plot the share of Trump voters against vaccine uptake, you find that the more Trump, the less they get vaccinated. And Republicans now are something like 5 or 6 times more likely to die from being unvaccinated and getting COVID than Democrats. I mean, if you volunteer to die, then to me that's an expression of more than, that's a belief of some sort. It's not just, I'm kidding around. Or maybe I don't know. But there are hard data that, behavioral data that suggests that these beliefs at some level matter. So we can't ignore them, even though I'm quite prepared to accept that some people just say this stuff, No more questions? Oh, yes.
Single dimension. You addressed it also that one sub-dimension is anti-elitism.
Yes.
Or the preference for people's sovereignty.
Yes. Yes.
I'm also involved in some studies where we have studied the relationship between the preference of voting AfD
yes.
and the denying of vaccination.
Yeah.
Effect of vaccination. same situation. It has nothing to do with East and West Germany. So we have communities in West Germany
Right.
where people are depressed or where there's a high social
Yeah.
inequality and
Yeah.
so situations bad.
Yeah.
And we have the same effect.
Exactly. Yeah, I would never link it to East and West, although as a first approximation, you know, if you draw the vote share of the AFD, you get the outline of the GDR in the map. I mean, it's stunning. You know, it's even if you never knew anything about German history, you'd ask, what the hell is going on here? So at the aggregate level, that there is a big difference. But I agree, that's not causal per se. What is really mattering is the circumstances. Absolutely. And I think there's also the solution that if you then go to these communities and look after them in a way that isn't patronizing. Yeah.
Not quite sure whether I managed to get it right, what I want to say.
Well, say it in German. And then.
No, it's not. I've been living more than 20 years in the UK, so English is not a problem. But from a psychodynamic point of view, what Donald Trump did, say, with this picture, was that he was showing some wishful thinking. And people understand that in this way. So if a psychotherapist wants to empower his patient, he would say, you are defining the situation. And so the definition basically is counter, we even have in developmental psychology, not counterproductive, but counter-realistic. So it is some sort of figurative thinking, counterfactual.
Yes.
That was the word. So counterfactual, and we've done quite a bit of research on counterfactual thinking.
Yeah.
Sometimes this can help to shape the future. So if Trump said, and believe me, I was very relieved when somebody else was right? But when he said, for instance, that COVID is just a flu.
Yeah.
Of course, it wasn't not a normal flu because we were dying, or many people were dying. And but now it's 2 years later. We have all these vaccinations. We have been reinfected several times, and we developed some immunity, which is not catastrophic as it would have been if we had followed Boris Johnson's herd immunity, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, this kind of definition that, say, my daughter would have been fighting 2 years ago, now she says it herself, you know? So
Yeah, I think I know what you're. Yeah.
So this is what I mean with wishful thinking and counterfactual.
That it can be successful.
And it can be successful, it can be disastrous. I'm a Berliner, so I was here when the wall came down. And, 1 or 2 years before, the Central Committee of the Communist Party had made an announcement that they acknowledged that the unconscious exists, but that was their end. It was not a beginning, it was the beginning.
Okay, I take your point. I think, well, absolutely. And of course, that's what makes it attractive, because a politics of belief, based on belief rather than evidence, is attractive, and it can work for a surprisingly long time. And to me, the best example is the UK, which for the last 6 years has been driven by, you know, the expression of belief in something called Brexit. And none of those beliefs had any connection to reality, but none of that mattered, because what mattered was the expression of belief. You got to believe in Britain, you know, global Britain and Britannia Unchained and all these things. You've heard all that stuff. And that works for a while, but it's all coming unstuck now because the wheels are falling off. And I think that is also, I think, what happened to Trump to some extent, although the correction that is necessary with Trump hasn't been completed yet. I think in the UK, we're in a transition between very different states.
I would call it a belief. I would say it's a prophecy.
No, a prophecy. Okay, that's, okay. Maybe that's a little too nuanced for this close to drinks, so.
So, maybe we continue the discussion at the drinks and the reception. The walls are not yet open, but they will open soon. So, but first, let's thank our speaker, Stephan Lewandowsky.
Well, thank you.